All right. Well, welcome everyone to another edition of the ISPP virtual seminar series, the Asia Pacific region. Today we are joined by I-Ching Li, who is a professor at the Department of Psychology at National Taiwan University. Her research covers the interplay between forms of prejudice, cultural contexts, and structural aspects of intergroup relations and social change. And she is has an admirable amount of methodological pluralism in her research, using methods such as historical reviews, field experiments, meta-analyses, laboratory experiments, and culturally sensitive surveys. And her research topics include culture, prejudice, and intergroup relations, gender issues, political psychology, and needs and power. And she's also received a bevy of awards from the Gordon Allport Intergroup Relations Prize from the SPSSI to the Young Scholar Research Award from National Science Council in Taiwan. And with that, let me turn it over to Professor Li for her presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. Thank you, Peter, for the very great introduction. Thanks, Peter, for the introduction. It's great that you include almost all the information that I listed here already. The presentation is going to be a combination of my research interests. I'm interested in political psychology because when I study in the US under Felicia Prato, that is when I was participating in ISPP and understand that there is a topic that people talk about how political systems or political behaviors may be studied from the psychology perspective. And so I'm trying to see how political psychology may be linked with the more conventional social psychology topics that I'm interested in. And the topic that the presentation that I'm going to giving is from my past observations of people's comments about democracy. And it is also why that can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And that is why that I think that political democracy needs to be systematically studied. As you can see, here are my services that I serve for the editorial board of political psychology and also the more general psychology journals and social psychology journals. Okay, I'm just going to go to my presentation. Okay, so what is democracy? Democracy is from Greek. Demokratia refers to people rule, but it's not only about people rule. I think the important part is the second part. When we talk about a system of government in which the majority of people rule, we need to be also be aware that the rights of the minority need to be protected. And so the guiding principles, I think most people would get that democracy is popular control, right? The outcomes of the elections would be determined by the majority. But I think at the same time that we need to make sure that there is political equality and rights to freedom of opinion and expression to make democracy works. And that is why I want to conduct the studies to see first how this opinion sharing is important, and also how much people get that democracy reflect this guiding principles. And I want to use American philosophers' words about democracy to emphasize that political decisions must treat everyone with equal concern and respect, that each individual person must be guaranteed fundamental civil and political rights no combination of other citizens can take away, no matter how numerous they are or how much they despise his or her race or morals or way of life. And so in the first study I conducted with my doctorate student, Fu Fei, we want to see whether democracy will be linked with attitude toward minority groups. from the ideas about democracy, we summarize two elements. We think that democracy needs to incorporate opinion sharing. It's not only about how you would voice your opinions, but at the same time, you need to hear other people's voices. And also that people would participate in the voting so that they can decide the outcome together. And because we don't have a particular idea about whether the benefits, we don't think that the benefit of democracy would only be strict to one group. That is why we measure attitudes toward immigrants as well as mental patients. And so in our first study, we use international data. It's data from 33 countries across 5 continents. We measure, in the data set, they measure attitude towards immigrants. And because they use positive items as well as negative items, that we think that they would portray tolerance as well as the prejudice. So we analyze them separately. And we also get the data from 60 indicators in the economists intelligence unit that kind of reflects civil liberties and the voting. I should emphasize that because the 2 indicators will be correlated positively, so we are not going to examine the interaction effect in the first study. And because different countries would have different immigration rates, they would encounter with immigrants in a various degree, so we control for that. And also because the data is individual nested in conditions, so we control for that. We conduct multi-level analysis. So as predicted, and you can see the graph here, the civil liberties and political participations were associated positively with tolerance toward immigrants. That is positive phrased items, as you can see. And also for prejudice against immigrants, we can see similar pattern, although political participation was not linked with prejudice in the conventional significant level. So what we see is that civil liberties in countries where they would enjoy more civil liberty and the political participation, the members in that country would show more passive attitude toward immigrants. And I should emphasize that civil liberties and political participations were not targeted at immigrants. They were assessed in the country level. But in this study, we are not sure whether we need both elements to work, because for the negative phrase item, it seems to be that civil liberties would be more robustly linked with attitude towards immigrants. And because the 2 are always positively associated. So we try to figure out a way to tell these 2 apart. That is why we do experiments. In the experiment, we create a condition where participants would ask to be engaged in the school's new course system. They would be asked whether they agree with the system change or not. And they will be randomly assigned to 4 conditions. These are 2x2 conditions. Whether they were allowed to share their opinions and see what other people think about the new course system, and whether they would be allowed to vote on the new system, or that we just collect their opinions and then we will hand it over to a team that would decide whether the school would impose the new course system. And then after they filled out their ideas about the new course system, that they would be led to say that we have a second student who couldn't finish her data collection, and it's just for survey items. So could they please fill out the survey items? Most of them agree. So we have enough data to analyze. And in the survey items, they would fill out a questionnaire about tolerance toward mental patients. And also we measure 2 potential mediators. we think that participating in political activities can increase one's rights consciousness, that they will be aware of their rights. At the same time, maybe they will think about other people's rights, and that might be what protecting minorities' rights. We also measure other-oriented passive emotions, such as caring, joy, pleasant. We think that by participating in democratic activities, by hearing other people's opinions and voicing your opinions, that you will feel like we are a community, that we should care about each other. So it's another potential mediator that we tested. And we can see here that from our 2x2 conditions, we do find an interaction effect. And the participants in the sharing opinion and voting condition will have more outgroup tolerance in comparison to participants who do not allow to share their opinions or that they could not vote. Okay. So we create an interaction score that we will use the scores in the sharing opinion and the voting condition in comparison to the 3 other conditions. And we want to see whether rights consciousness or other-oriented passive emotions may be the mediator. And we can see from here that the mediation of the other-oriented passive emotions is significant. That means that participants in the opinion sharing and the voting condition tend to show more other-oriented passive emotions in comparison to the other 3 conditions, and that they would also show more outgroup tolerance. For the rights consciousness will predict more outgroup tolerance, but our manipulation does not change rights consciousness. So here that we show that the reason for participating in democratic activities would protect minority rights through other-oriented passive emotions. So if democracy protects minority rights, why do we witness all these cases such as Hitler is arising from democratic system? And we can also see the riots in Capitol Hill in the US recently. And also in Taiwan, we also have this furious debate about whether we should incorporate same-sex marriage. And so I think that the ideals of democracy is not being fully understood or realized in nowadays. And this is not just what I think, but also shown in previous research. This research is from focus group on adolescents that they ask young adults why they vote and why they don't vote and why they feel alienated from the democratic system. And as you can see from the excerpt here, that many of them would mention the system is not working because the minorities, the poor, the powerless would not be represented by the system. And also for the, I think that is why for those who voted, they think that the system works. So they consider them as their duty to vote. But for those who don't vote, for those who don't believe the system, they have better things to do if they don't have any supporting candidate in the system. And I think though, political participation is going to hurt democracy in the end, although it's not the topic of my risk. It's not in this presentation that I will present data for, but I think that's the case. And it's not just for the Europe, as we can see that democracy is under siege. We can see that over the 15 years, democracy is declining, as you can see from here. And so I want to know like how people appreciate the basic principles in democracy. The data that I have is collaborated with James Liu as well as Sylvia Chen and Angela Liang. We collect data from 5 different countries. They vary in terms of their democracy levels. And we can see that Taiwan and the United States will be classified as democratic societies, where Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong would enjoy partly democracy. And the first question I ask is whether they think that democracy has an advantage over all other forms of government. And in 5 countries, and then midpoint would be 3. All of them would, all the mean score from these countries would be significantly above 3. Means that most of them would agree that democracy has an advantage over all other forms of government. But what does democracy mean when they filled out that question? That is why I separate them to 3 different questions. The first one is whether they think that the minority should have the right to express their own opinion. And how are they going to express their opinion? I would kind of put a label on the minority. In the second item, I would ask them whether they would agree that you cannot expect democracy to work as long as so many undereducated and unintelligent people have the vote. This is from my past observation that a lot of people question whether democracy could work in Chinese societies. Most of them would say, you know, there are so many uneducated people in China. How are you going to expect democracy to work? And that is why I incorporate this item. And also, I think a lot of countries, we can see extremists being questioned whether they should be allowed to participate in the political activities. So I also ask them that. And as you can see, when I don't put a label on minorities, I don't mean what minorities are. Then you can see from all countries that we collect data from that they would agree minority opinions should be expressed. But when it comes to unintelligent, uneducated people or extremists, then that's a different story. In the US, all 3 minority groups, the participants would show above the midpoint scores. That means that they would agree all 3 of the minority groups would have the right to express their ideas. But in Taiwan, it's for the uneducated people and minority opinion items. They don't have a particular position on extremists. But for the other countries where you can see that it's only when we don't talk about who the minority groups are that they will think they should be allowed to express their opinions. But when I put the label on, then participants in the other 3 countries would not agree that they should be allowed to participate or express their opinions. I also approach the data in a different way because I have the data from 2 time points. It's actually measured at 2 times, 3 months apart. So we can see how the general support of democracy linked with the 3 separate items. And as you can see, when it's minority opinions, general support of democracy will be linked with support for minority opinions to be expressed. But when it's unintelligent or uneducated or extremists, then it's not, okay? And in Malaysia, the correlation is even in the opposite direction than we expected. And I find it interesting that in Hong Kong and Taiwan, the more people support democracy, the more they agree that extremists need to be allowed to demonstrate. And I think maybe that is because we experience some demonstrations in which those participate in the demonstrations will be labeled as extremists, such as those in the sunflower movement or the umbrella movement. And so I want to say that even though when people think that they want to protect minority opinions for expression, but not when we kind of spell out who the minorities are. And I think that is because in societies that we have this delegitimizing ideologies against specific minority groups that would justify why we should exclude them from the democratic activities. And I also want to see whether support of democracy can predict their support for minority group. And so because I have the 2 time point, I kind of use the initial time point. We measure their support for democracy, the general democracy. And then I would want to see whether that would predict their support for minority group at time 2. Okay, let me just kind of spell out what I think. Because education levels have been found to predict protection or support for minority rights. So I use that as approximate distal causal factor. And I include social dominant orientation because social dominant orientation is often found to justify group-based hierarchy. And the 2, and also I will see whether support of democracy and social dominant orientation can predict support for minority group. And in the 2 minority groups, I use immigrants and older people. And I should emphasize that it's collected at time 2. And we see that social dominant orientation and support for democracy is negatively correlated as expected, because social dominant orientation would be kind of justify group-based hierarchy, and support for democracy would think that people should enjoy equal rights, and we should hear different people's opinions. So I think that would be used to support group-based egalitarianism. And so they are negatively correlated as expected. And education only predict more support for democracy in Hong Kong, but not in all other countries. And more importantly, we see that social dominant orientation in time 2 did predict support for minority. That means that those higher on social dominant orientation would be lower on support for minority. And for support for democracy, the more they support democracy, the more they support minority. And I forgot to say that the path would be fixed to be the same across countries if it doesn't affect the model fitness. And so if you see different numbers, that means that I cannot fix the path to be the same in Hong Kong. Support for democracy is more strongly linked with support for minority in Hong Kong in comparison to other countries. But for the other countries, the strength will be similar. So I fixed them to be the same. So in here, we can see how support of minority can be improved or increased by support for democracy. And that kind of answer my original question of whether democracy can protect minority rights. So in the 2 set of data, they seem to be, and I should mention that the model fitness is fine. The chi-square is not significant, and the fitness would be satisfying. Okay, but what can we explain the cases that we observed that at times it unnerved me, you know, like seeing those very furious debates and people disagree with each other at the point that it could attack each other. And so I think I want to look at another case, debate of same-sex marriage. In this case, we can see legitimizing and delegitimizing process simultaneously occur, not just in one country, but I think internationally, as well as in the scientific community. LGBTQs has been considered as a mental illness before 1974 and deprived of the rights to freedom, the right to marry, the right to work, the right to adopt children. I just attended a news conference about Taiwanese government should increase same-sex couples' right to adopt children. And you can see here that same-sex acts are considered criminal in some of the countries. So that's the legitimizing processes that we can see of the LGBTQ's rights. And from the right, you can see legitimizing processes also functioned to protect or give LGBTQ's rights. In the scientific communities, we kind of adjust and kind of try to say that, okay, homosexuality per se is not a mental illness, as well as gender non-conformity, as long as the person is comfortable with who they are. And we can see that there is a language from pathology to language of human rights. And so nowadays, in some of the countries, in most of the countries where research has been conducted on same-sex couples, we can see that there is a trend of identifying the problems is the society, not the same-sex couples. And also the UN would also adopt the human rights to include sexual minority concerns. And so I want to see, because in Taiwan, we are in this furious debate about same-sex marriage, and I want to see how that would affect attitudes towards same-sex marriage. And the data that I have is collected in 4 time points. I should mention the time would be important that I mentioned here, because in May 2017, the Constitutional Court in Taiwan would say that deprive same-sex couples the right to marry is not right. And the government has 2 years window to fix this problem. But in the end of 2018, referendums were called, and the opponents defeated the proponents of same-sex marriage in a deciding number of 2-1. So the supporters for same-sex marriage lose in that referendums soundly. And then, but afterwards in May 2019, in the time window that the Constitutional Court said that the government needs to implement some rules to protect same-sex couples' rights, the government did. Okay, so we have the same-sex marriage laws passed. And then short after, it's the election. Okay, so I want to see how support for same-sex couples for same-sex marriages, the attitude will change in these different time points. And I found an interaction between party preference and the time. On the right, let me backward and kind of describe the samples a little bit. We collected at 4 time points. In the first time, it would be about 3,500 participants, and they would be followed at 3 more time points. But we also added more participants as a booster sample. So when I analyze the data, I analyze the original data, and then I use the booster data to kind of replicate the findings. So as you can see from the last would be the original sample. And we can see that here is when the same-sex marriage legalized, okay? And this is when the referendums were called. And here are the elections. And we can see that for Penguin and other party supporters, they would have an increased support for same-sex marriage from the referendums to when the same-sex marriage was legalized. And then for the Penguin Party and other supporters would remain stable. But for the Pan-Blue Party supporters, they would reduce their support for same-sex marriage during the election, shortly before the election and afterwards. And I find a similar pattern that we can see an increase for during the time when same-sex marriage was legalized. And for the Penguin Party and other supporters, that they would increase their support. But for the Pen Blue Party's supporters, they don't. Okay, the elections will kind of reduce their support. So I think both data show very similar findings. That is, there is an increasing support among all supporters after the same-sex marriage was legalized. And so that the legalization of same-sex marriage was a legitimizing effect of same-sex marriage. But it would only stabilize the support or increase the support when the supporters are not in the opposing party. As you can see, that decreasing support among Pen Blue supporters before the election, both in the original and booster samples. I also try to see whether satisfaction with the government can predict the positive attitude towards same-sex marriage. And they did, as you can see here. After controlling for satisfaction with the government, is positively associated. That means that if they are more satisfied with the government at a previous time point, that they will show more support for same-sex marriage at a later time point. And after controlling for that, Pen Blue or Penguin's supporters contribute to the prediction sporadically. So my general discussion is that a well-functioned democracy is intricately tied with the protection of opinion rights, as we can see from my 3 studies. Opinion sharing and political participation are very important in democracy. However, conflict between political parties could drive both legitimizing and delegitimizing processes for minority rights. So as long as the topic is not receiving support across parties, then we can see that there will be some delegitimizing processes working underlying. And I think that although my study did not directly test this or study this, but there are some ideologies or some processes in which we deny rights for specific groups. And my study can link with previous studies, which are often done by political scientists, where they compare different forms of democracy, whether direct democracy or representative democracy can protect minority rights better. And I think the answer is still inconclusive. So I want to just reiterate the importance of thinking about democracy and how that it's not just about popular control. By understanding the spirits of democracy, maybe we can make it better or improve it in a way that more people can be involved in the political activities. And for future directions, I think that I can study more about the delegitimizing ideologies against the specific groups and why that it would function more. It would be more accepting in some countries than others. And I think my 3rd study also suggests that there might be some downward spirals if certain issues are in the political struggles of the parties. And I'm not so sure about potential solutions, but I want to study a little bit more about it. Okay, and I want to acknowledge all the research funds and assistance from my collaborators and RAs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, I-Ching. That was a great presentation. I have a couple of questions just to start off the Q&A. One is more specific. It's about the graph you showed about the various levels of support for same-sex marriage among green and blue, and then I guess the other party supporters. Yes, this one. So yeah. Are you measuring here that among even the Pen Blue Party members, support for same-sex marriage increased from the point that it was legalized or the election, like that upward trend? What period of time is that?
In this point, we do see that.
We've lost your audio.
I'll call her. I'll call her.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, you're back. You're back.
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
So we do see the increase is significant among Pemblue supporters in both studies. And I think that's what previous research would suggest. When a policy is endorsed by the government, then it's a legitimizing process. And it would kind of make people think of the ideas as normal, just, fair. What I show more, in addition to previous research, is that in the long run, there is a party split. The legitimizing effect will remain among supporters agreeing with the ruling parties or not, at least not opposing the ruling parties.
Okay. And second question, I guess, might be related to this. At least in the U.S., probably the most potent political force is the media system. Can you describe in kind of broad outline the media system in Taiwan and how that might influence the opinions of various partisans?
You mean like CNN more liberals and Fox more conservative like that?
Yeah, is the media system in Taiwan as polarized as in the US and some other countries?
I think some of the channels would, but not as obvious as in the US. But I think the media effect is not as strongly suggested as in the US. We have social medias. It's more about the social medias, and I think that most people would have lowest support for same-sex marriages during the referendums because of that. Because we use Line as a kind of social media, and a lot of false informations were spread through social medias, and the government cannot do anything about it.
I see. Okay, so oh, whoops! I'm supposed to stop recording during the Q&A. Forgot about that. Here we go.